Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure at this time to do the roll call for the inductees into the Martin Luther King Jr. Collegium of Scholars and Board of Sponsors. As I call your names, please stand and remain standing. James Abington, Michelle Alexander, Robert Andrew Cathy, Jerry D. Campbell, Michael D. Harris, Cheryl A. Kujawa Holbrook, Bunny Jackson Ransom, Blaine Kelly Jr., Sylvia Sanders Kelly, Judy Marks, Jan Bryant Swanson, Kelly Wright, Christine Roy Yoder. Thank you.
Please turn to the back of your program where you'll find the charge. And you may follow along with me, and I will read aloud. The charge is on the back of the program. The Morehouse College religious tradition was founded by the Reverend Dr. William Jefferson White in 1867 and was greatly enhanced by Henry Lyman Morehouse, Charles Thomas Walker, John Hope, Adam Daniel Williams. It reached its zenith during the tenure of Benjamin Elijah Mays. Strong Renaissance leadership came from Mordecai Wyatt Johnson, Howard Washington Thurman, Floyd McKissick, Samuel Woodrow Williams, Charles Radford Lawrence, Martin Luther King Sr., and Thomas Kilgore Jr. Because the crises of character education and character values in America require more ethically and spiritually oriented role models and moral examples, I am pleased to induct you into the Morehouse College prophetic religious tradition, the Martin Luther King Jr. Board of Sponsors, and Collegium of Scholars, and do hereby charge and challenge you to be affirmative and appreciative, coherently critical examples for this generation of students, always remembering that our vision is the creation of a global society in which the full development of each individual's potential is the central goal. I charge you to be faithful servant scholar leaders, guarantors of continuity, celebrators of change, negotiators of structure, ambassadors of the beloved world community, and facilitators of meaning, with the hope that we can right age-old wrongs that continue to haunt the American people and the world. Lastly, I charge you to use your time, talent, tender, and technology to help usher in an age of peace and nonviolence for the children of the world, to raise another generation of morally inspired leaders committed to building the beloved world community, in token of which you are now given these citations, which list 20 global ethical options by which Dr. King and many Hindus, Buddhists, Muslims, Jews, Christians, and scientists live their lives and transform the world. Testifying to this investiture and in witness whereof, under the seals of the college and the chapel. The signatures of duly authorized officers are hereunto affixed. This 10th day of April, 2012, Par Dominum Nostrum Jesum Christum.
Good morning. We welcome members of the Morehouse College family to this important gathering, and on behalf of the trustees, faculty, staff, alumni, and students, we commend these new inductees to the Martin Luther King Jr. Collegium of Scholars and Board of Sponsors. You are now part of an esteemed community, a part of the Morehouse College family. We celebrate your individual achievements and your collective impact on uplifting humanity. And so we welcome you to this place. I also want to thank the men of Morehouse for your service, not only to our neighborhood in the West End of Atlanta, but nationally, as you have raised issues of justice and concern related to the Trayvon Martin case and many other issues related to our criminal justice system, about which we will hear momentarily. Continue your good work, young men. This is an important part of being a Morehouse man. It's my great pleasure to present to the Morehouse audience, for her first visit to Morehouse College, Professor Michelle Alexander. Ms. Alexander is a graduate of Vanderbilt University and the Stanford Law School, and a 2005 recipient of the Soros Justice Fellowship. She served as the director of the Racial Justice Project at the ACLU of Northern California for several years, and helped to spearhead a national campaign against racial profiling by law enforcement. Ms. Alexander directed the Civil Rights Clinic at Stanford Law School and clerked for U.S. Supreme Court Justice Harry Blackmun. She also clerked for Chief Judge Abner Mikva on the U.S. Court of Appeals, D.C. Circuit. Currently, she holds a joint appointment with the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity and the Moritz College of Law at Ohio State University. In 2010, Ms. Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow: Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, was released. And in this compelling book, Ms. Alexander asserts that the mass jailing of Black people in America functions as a form of racial control, much the same way that Jim Crow did. This book received in 2011 the NAACP Award for Nonfiction and was released this year in paperback. We have copies of the book in the nave of the chapel, and I want you to know it is a compelling and important text. I hope that all of you will have a copy in your library as we continue to press for justice in this country. Morehouse College, we welcome Professor Michelle Alexander, who is opening a national conversation about why our prisons and jails look the way they do. And I hope that we will listen carefully and carry forward this important message in our daily activism. We welcome Dr. Michelle Alexander. Following this musical selection, from the world-class Morehouse College Glee Club. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this beautiful induction ceremony, honoring and celebrating our commitment to pursuing justice with faith, honoring our deepest spiritual commitments as we strive for social and racial justice in America. We are living in confusing times today, a time of great paradox. You turn on your television set and there is Barack Obama, our nation's first black president, standing in the Rose Garden behind a podium looking handsome, dignified, and in charge. You flip the channel And there is Michelle Obama, a brown-skinned woman digging a garden in the backyard of the White House, not as a servant or a maid or a slave, but as the First Lady, schooling our nation on good health and how to be good stewards of our planet. You flip the channel again, and there is the whole Obama family descending Air Force One, waving to the crowd. A gorgeous black family living in the White House, ruling the world, cheered by millions around the globe. You flip the channel again, and there is George Zimmerman. There is Trayvon Martin's mother with tears streaming down her cheeks. A young black man wearing a hoodie and carrying nothing but Skittles and an iced tea, killed by a wannabe cop, a self-appointed neighborhood watchman, a tragic killing if the boy who had been perceived as a threat, as a problem, had been white rather than black, he would most likely be alive today. But because of who he was, a young black man, a problem to be dealt with, managed, interrogated, confronted, and controlled. Trayvon Martin is now dead. There is yet to be an arrest. And this is in our colorblind, supposedly free America. We are told that George Zimmerman stood his ground, and now I've been watching as thousands of Americans have been standing their ground, protesting, engaging in peaceful, nonviolent protests from coast to coast. Protests sweeping the nation, and I've been watching these protests, listening to the demands for justice. I watched as President Obama said that if he had a son, he would look like Trayvon. I have tuned into the press conferences and listened to what many of our leaders have had to say. I have seen the angry faces, I've seen the handmade signs, and I shouted out loud with joy when the Million Hoodie March flooded the streets of New York City. But something is missing. It nags at me, and it keeps me up at night. I find that as I flip the channels and watch the coverage, I'm listening, but I'm also searching for something in the speeches, the rhetoric, and the demands, something that eludes me. I keep wanting to hear something that's not quite there. I am yearning for a different kind of truth-telling, a truth that is deeper than who did what when, a truth-telling that exists in a realm beyond politics, beyond grand juries, a truth-telling that can't be captured in a 30-second soundbite, a truth that is less about spin and more about revolution, a moral revolution, a truth that will shake the foundations of a system that is as morally bankrupt as the old Jim Crow, even if it looks better on the evening news. I want someone to turn over the tables in the temple and say this is not just about Trayvon Martin or George Zimmerman. The soul of our nation is in jeopardy, and nothing short of a revolution in our thinking, in our values, our popular theology can save us. Just months before his death, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. said quite bluntly, quote, "I do not see how we will ever solve the turbulent problem of race confronting our nation until there is an honest confrontation with it and a willing search for the truth and a willingness to admit the truth when we discover it." So in Dr. King's honor today, and in that tradition, I'm going to do my best to tell the truth about race and justice in America today. It's a truth that most Americans will deny, just as they denied the truth about slavery and Jim Crow. But the truth is this: we as a nation have taken a wrong turn, a tragic detour in our stride toward freedom. We have betrayed Dr. King's dream. In 1968, Dr. King gave a speech entitled "The Other America" at Grosse Pointe High School. He said, quote, "There are two Americas, One America is beautiful. In this America, millions of people have the milk of prosperity and the honey of equality flowing before them. This America is the habitat of millions of people who have food and material necessities for their bodies, culture and education for their minds, freedom and human dignity for their spirits. In this America, children grow up in the sunlight of opportunity. But there is another America. This other America has a daily ugliness about it that transforms the buoyancy of hope into the fatigue of despair. He then went on to cite the inadequate, overcrowded, and fundamentally unequal schools. He described the high rates of unemployment in the Black community. The official rate of Black unemployment at that time was about 9%. But he noted that figure did not include all those who had given up all hope of looking for work. He said the unemployment figures, quote, do not take into consideration the thousands of people who have given up, who have lost all motivation for work, the thousands of people who have had so many doors closed in their faces that they feel defeated and they no longer go out and look for jobs, the thousands who have come to feel that life is a long and desolate corridor with no exit signs. The vast majorities of Negroes in America find themselves perishing on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. Well, I think we owe Dr. King as well as ourselves an answer to this question. What really has changed? Most people today of all colors will tell you so much has changed. They'll say, just look at all the Black lawyers and Black doctors. We're free now to sit at any lunch counter. We're no longer relegated to the back of the bus. Just look at Barack Obama. Just look at Oprah Winfrey. Just look at Colin Powell. Just look at Condoleezza Rice. Our nation has come a long way. And then the familiar line, but of course we still have a long way to go. This kind of talk, this familiar line, implies that we're on the right path, that if we just keep plodding along, keep forging ahead, sooner or later, we'll make it to the promised land. But is that right? Are we truly on the right path? The same path that Dr. King was traveling, or have we made a tragic U-turn? Could it be that we're heading right back to where we began? Most of the indicators of Black well-being that Dr. King cited in his Other America speech are actually worse today than they were back then. Worse. Today, only 35% of Black boys nationwide graduate from high school. The figure is 26% in New York City. Only 12% of Black fourth-grade boys are proficient in reading, and shocking numbers are still not proficient in high school. Today, as in 1968, the reason for these shocking figures is not that Black children lack native intelligence or a desire to learn. It's that their schools are so fundamentally inadequate, and that hopelessness and despair pervades their communities, their families, and their lives. The reasons are largely the same as they were back then. Dr. King complained that the official Black unemployment rate in 1968 was 9%, with rates much higher if you count all those who have given up looking for work. Well, today, in cities across America, if you count those who have given up looking for work or who are behind bars, 50% of Black men are jobless. 50%. The Center for Economic Development at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee issued a report showing that 53.3% of working-age Black men in Milwaukee are jobless, the highest ever recorded. Black unemployment rates have been breaking records nationwide, but with scarcely any notice. Data released by the Community Service Society showed that only 25% of young Black men in New York City actually have a job. Now, I wish I could say that's the worst of it, but it's not. I promise to do my best to tell you the truth as boldly and fearlessly as Dr. King once did when few were willing to listen or wanted to hear it. So here it is. During the last 30 years, a vast new system of racial and social control has emerged from the ashes of slavery and Jim Crow. It is a system of mass incarceration that no doubt would have Dr. King turning in his grave. The systematic mass incarceration of poor people of color in the United States is tantamount to a new caste system when specifically designed to address the social, political, and economic challenges of our time. It is the moral equivalent of Jim Crow. Now, I will admit that there was a time when I rejected this kind of talk. There was a time when I resisted comparisons between mass incarceration and slavery, or mass incarceration and Jim Crow, believing those kinds of claims and comparisons were exaggerations, were distortions, were hyperbole. In fact, there was a time when I thought that people who made those kinds of claims and comparisons were actually doing more harm than good to efforts to reform our criminal justice system and achieve greater racial equality in the United States. But what a difference a decade makes. For after years of working as a civil rights lawyer and advocate, representing victims of racial profiling and police brutality, and investigating patterns of drug law enforcement in poor communities of color, and attempting to assist people who had been released from prison re-enter into a society that had never shown much use for them in the first place, I had a series of experiences that began what I now call my awakening. I began to awaken to a racial reality that is so obvious to me now that what seems odd in retrospect is that I had been blind to it for so long. As I write in the introduction to my book, The New Jim Crow, what has changed since the collapse of Jim Crow has less to do with the basic structure of our society than the language we use to justify it. In the era of color blindness, it is no longer socially permissible to use race explicitly as a justification for discrimination, exclusion, and social contempt. So we don't. Rather than rely on race, we use our criminal justice system to label people of color criminals and then engage in all the practices that we supposedly left behind. Today, it is perfectly legal to discriminate against criminals in nearly all the ways in which it was once legal to discriminate against African Americans. Once you're labeled a felon, the old forms of discrimination, employment discrimination, housing discrimination, denial of the right to vote, exclusion from jury service, suddenly legal. As a criminal, you have scarcely more rights and arguably less respect than a black man living in Alabama at the height of Jim Crow. We have not ended racial caste in America, we have merely redesigned it. Here are a few of the facts that I uncovered in the course of my work and research that began to open my eyes. There are more African American adults under correctional control today, in prison or jail, on probation or parole, than were enslaved in 1850, a decade before the Civil War began. A black child born today has less of a chance of being raised by both parents than a black child born during slavery. And this is due in large part to the mass incarceration of black men. More than 80% of black children born in the United States can expect to spend a significant part of their childhood years growing up apart from their fathers. And contrary to the image presented in the media of black men being a bunch of deadbeat dads that don't want to do right by their children, don't want to be parents, don't want to provide for their children, don't want to pay the rent, want to shirk their duties and responsibilities as a parent, the research actually shows that black men who are separated from their children due to divorce, imprisonment, or any other factor, are actually more likely to maintain meaningful contact, to make efforts to maintain meaningful relationships with their children than men of any other racial or ethnic group. But no other group faces such extraordinary challenges in playing the role of a traditional father today than black men who are locked up at young ages and then permanently locked out. This is not a phenomenon that affects some small segment of the African American community. No, to the contrary, in large urban areas today, more than half of working age African American men now have criminal records and are thus subject to legalized discrimination for the rest of their lives. In cities like Chicago and Baltimore, figures are even more staggering. If you count all those who are in prison, who are, of course, excluded from poverty statistics and unemployment data, thus masking the severity of racial inequality in the United States, but if you actually count prisoners as people, in the Chicago and the Baltimore areas, nearly 80% of working-age African-American men have criminal records and are thus subject to legalized discrimination for the rest of their lives. These men are part of a growing undercaste, not class, caste, a group of people defined largely by race, relegated to a permanent second-class status by law. Now, I'm sure there's at least a couple of people who are thinking, what is she talking about? Our criminal justice system isn't a system of racial control, it's a system of crime control. And if black people would stop running around committing so many crimes, they wouldn't have to worry about being locked up and then stripped of their basic civil and human rights. But therein lies the greatest myth about mass incarceration, namely that it's been driven by crime and crime rates. It's not true. It's not true. During the past 3 decades, our prison population has exploded, has quintupled. We've gone from a prison population of around 300,000 to now well over 2 million. We have the highest rate of incarceration in the world, dwarfing the rates of even highly repressive regimes like Russia, China, and Iran. But again, this is not simply due to crime rates. During the past few decades, crime rates have fluctuated, gone up, have gone down. Today, as bad as crime rates are, in many parts of the country, crime rates nationally are at historical lows. But incarceration rates, especially black incarceration rates, have consistently soared. Most criminologists and sociologists today will acknowledge that crime rates and incarceration rates in the United States have moved independently of one another. Incarceration rates, especially black incarceration rates, have soared regardless of whether crime is going up or going down in any given community or the nation as a whole. So what does explain this sudden explosion in incarceration? The emergence of a penal system unprecedented in world history, if not crime and crime rates? Well, the answer is the war on drugs and the Get Tough movement. A wave of punitiveness that washed over the United States. Even as many people of faith and conscience, people who supposedly believe in the power of forgiveness and redemption, people who supposedly believe in the necessity of standing our ground with the least of these, my brethren, stood idly by and were eerily quiet. Convictions for drug offenses alone, accounted for about 2/3 of the increase in the federal prison system and more than half of the increase in the state system between 1985 and 2000, the period of our prison system's most dramatic expansion. To get a sense of how large a contribution the war on drugs has made to mass incarceration, consider this. There are more people locked up in our nation's prisons and jails today just for drug offenses, than were incarcerated for all reasons in 1980. Now, those who imagine that this drug war has been focused on rooting out violent offenders or drug kingpins should think again. The overwhelming majority of people swept into our criminal justice system, especially through this drug war, have been nonviolent, relatively minor offenders, overwhelmingly poor people of color. In 1990s, for example, at the height of the drug war, nearly 80% of the increase in drug arrests were for marijuana possession, a drug that has now been shown to be less harmful, less addictive than alcohol or tobacco, and at least as prevalent in middle-class white communities and on college campuses as it is in the hood. But those who do time for drug crime in the United States are overwhelmingly black and brown. Studies have consistently shown now for decades that, contrary to popular belief, people of color are no more likely to use or sell illegal drugs than whites, or sell. Now that defies our basic stereotypes about who a drug dealer is. No matter what your color is, if you imagine a drug dealer, you likely imagine some black kid standing on a street corner with his pants sagging down. And plenty of drug dealing happens in the hood, but it happens everywhere else in America as well. A white kid living in rural Kansas doesn't drive to the hood to get his marijuana or his meth or his cocaine. No, he gets it from someone of his own race down the road. A young person attending Columbia University or Stanford, they don't go to the hood to get their ecstasy or their mushrooms, their meth, their cocaine. No. They get it most likely from someone of their own race. Drug markets, much like American society generally, are highly segregated by race. Blacks typically sell to blacks, whites to whites, Latinos to each other. Drug dealing happens in every community of all colors, but those who do time for drug crime are black and brown. In some states, 80 to 90% of all drug offenders sent to prison have been one race, African American. And of course, once released from prison, having been swept in often at young ages, they find themselves in a parallel social universe. They find themselves stripped of the very rights supposedly won in the civil rights movement. They find they face a lifetime of discrimination, scorn, and social exclusion. Most people branded felons find it difficult even to survive on the outside. For the rest of their lives, they must check that dreaded box on employment applications asking, have you ever been convicted of a felony? And it doesn't matter if that felony happened a few weeks ago, a few months ago, or 35 years ago. For the rest of your life, you must check that box, knowing full well the odds are sky high that application's going straight to the trash. People tell me, well, they could get a job at McDonald's. You could get a job somewhere. Getting a job at McDonald's with a felony record is no easy feat. People say there must be something they can do. Well, in my state, in Ohio, you can't even get a license to be a barber if you've been convicted of a felony. People released from prison are barred from public housing, typically. Young man wants to go home and do right by his children, go home to his children, to his partner, to his spouse who lives in public housing. The whole family risks eviction just by letting daddy come home. People who have drug convictions may be barred even from food stamps to survive. What do we expect folks to do? Deny jobs, housing, maybe barred even from food stamps to survive? What does the system seem designed to do? It seems designed to send folks right back to prison, which is what in fact happens. About 70% of the time, about 70% of people released from prison return within 3 years, and the majority of those who return in many states do so in a matter of months because the challenges associated with mere survival on the outside are so immense. Most people trapped in the undercast cycle in and out of prison, sometimes for the rest of their lives. Why have we chosen this path? Why have we chosen to create a vast new racial undercast in America? Well, I could spend hours describing the racial politics that gave rise to the drug war and the Get Tough movement, the myriad ways in which politicians from both political parties have exploited our nation's racial divisions and anxieties for political gain with Get Tough slogans and rhetoric. And I could tell you about the ways in which the seismic shifts In the U.S. economy, from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy to now a service-based economy, have made black men in particular uniquely vulnerable. No longer needed to pick cotton in the fields or labor in factories, black men have found themselves suddenly disposable, no longer necessary to the functioning of the U.S. economy. But the truth is, those are just the facts. They are not the truth. The spiritual truth that lies at the core of what we as a nation have done again. In the years following Dr. King's death, our nation was faced with a choice, a fork in the road. We could continue down the road that Dr. King and many others were traveling. We could choose the path of compassion, forgiveness, inclusion, and hope. Or we could choose a different road, a road more familiar when it comes to matters of race, the road of exclusion, division, punitiveness, and despair. One day, I believe historians will look back on this era of mass incarceration, and they will say it was there, right there at the prison gates, that we abandoned Dr. King's dream and veered off the trail that he and many others had blazed. We took a detour, a tragic U-turn, that would result in millions of people locked up and permanently locked out. We have now spent $1 trillion, yes, $1 trillion, just waging the drug war since it began. Funds that could have been used for schools, economic investment in our poorest neighborhoods, for job creation, for small businesses. $1 trillion could have been used to promote our collective well-being. Instead, those dollars paved the way for the destruction of countless lives, families, and dreams. So what do? Where do we go from here? Well, my own view is that nothing short of a major social movement, a spiritually grounded movement, grounded in a deep spirituality, a spirituality that has moral courage, to turn over the tables in the White House, the temple, the church, and anywhere where the least of these may have been forgotten. Only a movement will do. Only a major movement that has as its goal nothing less than saving the soul of this nation has any hope of ending mass incarceration in America and inspiring a recommitment to Dr. King's dream. Now, if you are among those who doubt that such a movement is really necessary today, consider this. If we were to return to the rates of incarceration we had in the 1970s or early 1980s, before the war on drugs and the Get Tough movement kicked off, we would have to release 4 out of 5 people who are behind bars today. 4 out of 5. More than 1 million people employed by the criminal justice system would lose their jobs. Most new prison construction has occurred in predominantly white rural communities, communities that often fragile economically. Those prisons across America would have to close down. Private prison companies listed on the New York Stock Exchange be forced to watch their profits vanish, go bankrupt. This system is now so deeply rooted in our social, political, and economic structure, it's not going to just fade away. It's not going to just disappear, downsize. Without a major upheaval, a fairly radical shift in our consciousness. Now, I know there are many people today who say there's no hope of ending mass incarceration in America. There's no hope of reinventing our schools. There's no hope of rebirthing our communities. Just as many were resigned to Jim Crow in the South and said, yeah, it's a shame, but that's just the way that it is, many people today view the millions cycling in and out of our prisons and jails as just an unfortunate but inalterable fact of American life. Well, I know that Dr. King and Ella Baker and Sojourner Truth and all those who risked their lives to end earlier systems of racial and social control would not be so easily deterred. So I believe if we are to truly honor them, to honor the spiritual warriors who came before us, we have got to be willing to continue their work. We've got to be willing to go back, pick up where they left off, and have the courage to stand alone in speaking a very unpopular truth. In 1968, Dr. King told advocates that the time had come to transition from a civil rights movement to a human rights movement. Meaningful equality, he said, could not be achieved through civil rights alone. Basic human rights must be honored. The right to work, the right to quality education, the right to housing, the right to food. Without basic human rights, he said, civil rights are an empty promise. So in honor of Dr. King and all those who labored to end the old Jim Crow, I hope we will commit ourselves to building a spiritually grounded human rights movement to end mass incarceration, a movement for education, not incarceration, a movement for jobs, not jails, a movement to end all those forms of discrimination against people released from prison, discrimination that denies them their basic human rights to work, to shelter, and to food. But before this kind of movement can even get underway, a great awakening is required. We've got to awaken from this colorblind slumber that we've been in to the realities of race in America. And we've got to be willing to embrace those labeled criminals. Not necessarily all their behavior, but them, their humanness. For it has been the refusal and failure to recognize the dignity and humanity of all people that has formed the sturdy foundation for every caste system that has ever existed in the United States or anywhere else in the world. It's our task, I firmly believe, to end not just mass incarceration, but to end this history and cycle of caste in America. Thank you so much. God bless.
Professor Alexander, by that applause, I think the students heard you. Now I hope and pray that when we leave here, we will not just take the words and listen to them, but we will go and we will be the change that we wish to see in the world. Thank you again, Professor Alexander, for that inspiring speech, that call to action. We hope that many of you, as you leave the chapel this afternoon, that you will stop by the book table if you have not already purchased her groundbreaking work, Mass Incarceration, the New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. It's available in the lobby. Professor Alexander will be out there at approximately 12:15 to sign books for all who have them or have purchased them and would like to have her sign copies of those books. We will be taking an official photograph with our honorees and our platform party immediately following this service, and so we ask that you not approach the stage. They will take a photograph. She will be available for a book signing at 12:15. For those of you who have registered for the College of Ministers and Laity Conference or who have accompanied our honorees, we will be having our honorees luncheon in the Shivers Dining Hall at 12:30. We will have chapel assistants stationed at the front of the chapel to direct you to that honorees luncheon. We do invite you all to come back to the chapel right here at 1:30 p.m. this afternoon as Professor Alexander will return for a panel discussion. On that panel, we will have Attorney Alexander, the Reverend Timothy McDonald, the pastor of the First Iconium Baptist Church here in Atlanta, Dr. Brian Marks, Assistant Professor of Psychology and Director of the Morehouse Male Initiative here at Morehouse College, and Dr. Ian Allman, Professor of English with a focus in South Asian and post-colonial literature and theory at Georgia State University. That will begin promptly at 1:30 right here in the King Chapel. At 3 p.m., we will have Mr. Jeffrey Small, who is a blogger, author, and scholar of world religions, who will give our opening plenary address titled The World House, Exploring the Multi-Faith World. And tonight at 7 p.m., we will have our second installment of our Intergenerational Festival of Preaching. Last night, we heard from the Reverend E. Dewey Smith, Jr., pastor of the Greater Travelers Rest Baptist Church here in Atlanta, and Reginald Wayne Sharp, Jr., one of our own members of the Morehouse College class of 2013. Tonight at 7 p.m., we will hear from the Reverend Dr. Howard John Wesley, the Reverend Dr. Claiborne Lee, Jr., and the Reverend Dr. Sean H. McMillan. Our full conference events and schedule can be accessed on our website, www.mlkchapel.org. Thank you. Let us all stand as we prepare to sing our college hymn. And then we ask, after you sing the hymn, that you would be seated as Dr. Oliver gives us our postlude.